For Mendel's second experiment, he continued working with pea plants, but this time he wanted to study 2 traits at a time. When 2 traits are involved at a time with a particular cross, we would call this a dihybrid cross. And what Mendel chose to look at was pea shape and pea color. Being round is dominant to being wrinkled, and being yellow is dominant to being green. If you look at the top of this diagram on the right, you can see that Mendel crossed a pea plant that was round and yellow, which is homozygous dominant for both traits, with a pea that is homozygous recessive for both, which would be a green, wrinkly pea. When he crossed those, all of the offspring were heterozygous for both traits, which made the pea plants yellow and round. And then he took that generation and he crossed those pea plants, and he actually found that the pea offspring contained 4 different phenotypes. And some of them were yellow and round, some were yellow and green, some were wrinkly and yellow, and then some were wrinkly and green. So there were 4 different phenotypes that were controlled by these 9 different genotypes. And so what does this cross look like in a Punnett square form? So if we were to take the 2 pea plant parents from his second generation and put them in a Punnett square, what would that look like? Well, it would look like this, a dihybrid cross. So this is showing Mendel's 2 generations, or his second generation, being crossed and all of the possible offspring that cross would produce. You need to remember when you are looking at a dihybrid cross here that the parents are diploid. They have 2 alleles per trait. And when you are looking at a Punnett square, even a bigger one, a dihybrid cross, the gametes are found on the outside. So the gametes go on the outside of the Punnett square, and they are haploid, which means they have 1 allele per trait. So at each point on this image where you see a orange arrow, that's a gamete, and it contains 1 allele for shape, which is an R, and 1 allele for color, which is a Y. When you are looking at a dihybrid cross, you can count up how many offspring would be expected to have each genotype. So how many in this image would be big R, big R, big Y, big Y? Well, I could look through there and I see 1, and there's actually only 1, so I would write 1 out of 16. I could look to see how many are heterozygous for both of these traits, and I see 1, 2, 3, 4. How many are homozygous recessive for both? So how many are going to be wrinkly and green? There's just 1. Heterozygous for shape and homozygous recessive for the color. I see 1, 2, just 2 out of 16. Homozygous recessive for shape and homozygous dominant for color, I see 1. And for the next one, I see there's 2 that have that genotype. 1, just 1 that is homozygous dominant for shape, and 1 and homozygous recessive for color. There's 2 that have this genotype, and then lastly, there would be 2 that has this genotype. So you need to be able to look at a dihybrid cross and figure out, well, how many have each genotype? You also need to be able to figure out how many have each phenotype, so what traits they have. So how many here are round and yellow? There would be 9 out of 16. How many are round and green? Hopefully you see 3 that are round and green. How many are wrinkly and yellow? You should be seeing 3 of those as well. And then that leaves just 1 little wrinkly green pea. 1 out of 16. Things to keep in mind when you are completing a dihybrid cross is that when you are writing the genotypes, you need to put similar letters together. So group them together. Also, if one of the sets of alleles is heterozygous, they're different, make sure you put the dominant one first. So capital letters would go first. What goes on the outside of the Punnett square? Possible allele combinations in the gametes. The gametes are haploid, so each gamete on the outside of the Punnett square should always just have 1 of each letter. So we're going to practice this. So if we are looking at one parent that is heterozygous for 2 traits, What are the possible allele combinations for the gametes that this parent can make? So we are given big T, big P, little p. That's diploid. There's 2 alleles for each trait. There's 2 T's, there's 2 P's. The gametes are made through meiosis, which means they will end up being haploid and have only 1 allele per trait. So each gamete will have 1 T and 1 P. And so what these options will end up looking like is this. Each gamete option will have 1 T and 1 P. So this parent can actually make 4 different types of gametes with either a T or a P allele in them. I'll have 1 T and 1 P, but they will come in different varieties, recessive or dominant. For parent 2, we have somebody who is homozygous recessive for these same traits. So little t, little p, little p. What are the possible allele combinations for the gametes for this individual? Well, they are all going to be the same because they don't have dominant alleles to put into their gametes. So they will all be just little t, little p. Since the gametes go on the outside of a Punnett square, now that we have this figured out, we can put them on the outside of our Punnett square, our dihybrid cross. So we will put the gametes for parent 1 on the top, and the gamete option for parent 2, we are going to put on the left-hand side. And actually, since there's only one option, we can just put that at the top row there and leave the rest of them blank so we're not repeating ourselves. We need to fill in our Punnett square. So we just look to the left and we look up to see which alleles are going to be placed into that zygote. And now we can use this to answer questions. So this question says, pea plants can be either tall or short and can have purple flowers or white flowers. If a tall purple plant is crossed with a short white plant, what is the chance they will have offspring that is short with purple flowers? So if we look at our dihybrid cross up above, we will see that only one of these options would be a short purple plant. So our answer would be 25%. What is the chance the offspring will be homozygous recessive for both traits? So we look up above again, and we're trying to see which ones are all recessive lowercase alleles there. And I see just one there, so again, that's 25%. The law of independent assortment says that genes for different traits are inherited independently of each other. So this just means that genes that are for different traits like height or color or texture or whatever it is, they don't always travel together with a certain other trait. They can be mixed up in new combinations. Genetic recombination is also something that can create new varieties of traits, different combinations. So this happens in meiosis 1 during prophase 1 when the homologous chromosomes will actually line up and they will swap pieces. So they can swap genes. This just creates more variation in offspring. And that is everything you need to know about dihybrid crosses.